Hey there, so welcome back. So in this video, we are going to continue building our challenge application using Java Spring Boot and Intellij Idea. If you have not subscribed to my channel, I would request you all to do so and also smash the like button. This will motivate me to bring more such content to you all for free. So without further ado, let's get started. All right, so welcome back. So this is what we are going to build is what we have discussed in our previous video. So we are going to cover the get query or the get API for the challenges endpoint. Okay. And we are going to cover the rest of the endpoints one by one. Okay. So let's head over to our Intellij Idea. So here in Intellij, I have the IDE set up entirely. Okay, I have unzipped the project and I have opened the project. Let us take a look at what exists in our project right now and how is a typical Spring Boot project is structured. Okay, so you can see here I have the main directory where my project resides. I have some folder like Intellij. These are the configuration files related to Intellij, so we don't need to touch them. We have some files related to Maven, which again we are not supposed to touch. Then we have the SRC folder. Now this is where all our source code will reside. So you have the main folder wherein you will be writing all the source code. And then you have the test folder wherein you will be writing all the tests that you'll need for your application. So I'll just collapse this test folder. Now within this main folder, you have Java and resources. So under Java is where all your Java files will reside. So if you expand this a bit, you will see the package structure that we have defined. And then you have this main application page. Okay. So this is a page wherein you will have the main method. And this is the main method that will be responsible for running your Spring Boot application. And you can see this annotation over here, @Spring Boot application, which tells that this is like this entire file is a Spring Boot application. Okay. And now you will be able to add more files and structure to your project. So under this package is where we will start writing our code. Okay. And then you have the resources folder where you can have the static files and the templates. And then you have application.properties. So this is a file which is empty. It's a .properties file wherein you can store the properties that define your application. Now, if you go down, you have a pom.xml. Okay, so if you click on this and let me collapse this project structure. So you will see this is the pom.xml Maven file. Okay, this is typically needed by Maven to manage all the dependencies. And this particular file has all the information that is needed for your project. Okay, and if you scroll down, you have the group ID here. Okay, so this is the group ID of the parent and this is the group ID of the project. Okay, and you can see the name of the application and the description as to what we had mentioned on the Spring Initializer website. And here we have the Java version that our application will be using. So if you scroll down, you have the dependencies. So this is the Spring Boot starter test. Okay. And this is the Spring Boot starter web. So this tells that our application is a web-based application. And here is where Spring Boot will provide everything and make available everything that typically a Spring Boot web application needs. Okay, so I have this pom.xml defined. Now let us open up our project structure here and let us start writing some code to get the list of all the challenges. Okay, so like I said, we are building this particular endpoint get/challenges, which will return all the challenges that we have within our application. So here I'm going to first define a controller. Okay, so I'll say Java class and I'll say challenge. controller. So I have this controller created, all right. And now we need something to store the list of our challenges, because that is where what this controller is going to return. Okay, so I'm going to say private list and I'm going to say challenge. Okay, and I'm going to say challenges. So let's call it challenges is equal to new array list. So for now, I'm going to store all my challenges in the form of array list, and we are getting an error. So now we are getting an error which says cannot resolve the symbol challenge. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to click on more actions here and we need to say create a class challenge. It will confirm where this class should be created. So I'll say okay, and you will have this class created in the same directory over here. Okay, now this is a class where we are going to define the structure of a typical challenge that we will have in our application. So what do we want to store with our challenges? So I'll say private long ID. So we'll store three things. One is ID, then we'll store the month, and this will help us define the month against which the challenge is stored. And then we are going to have some description about the challenge. Okay, so I'm going to say ID and then I'm going to say string month, and then let's have private string description. So this should be S capital. Okay, so this is defined. Now we can define the constructor. Okay, so I can right click and say generate, and I'll generate a constructor, and then I will have right click, generate, and I'll generate getter and setters for all. Okay, so our class is done. So this is the class that will help us store all the challenges information. Okay, and here in the controller we have that error message go away. All right, now let us define an endpoint to get the list of challenge. So I'm going to say over here public list. So this will be a method which will enable us to return all the challenges to the user, and I'm going to say challenge here. So since we are returning the list of all the challenges, this is what our return type should be. Okay, and I'm going to say get all challenges. Okay, and this is the method, and I'll say return. I'll simply return this challenges object over here, which is being stored as a list. All right, now I want to tell you, like, this is how our application will function. So from the browser or from the Postman, if you send a request, that is going to be managed by controller. The request will be routed then to service. So controller will do the acceptance of request, okay, from the appropriate controller methods. So within controller, you typically have a lot of methods that are responsible for managing different kinds of requests. How? That is something you'll see shortly. And then when the request is mapped to a particular method, that request is being forwarded to that of service. Okay, now service is a place where all the logic resides, like all the business logic resides. And then if there is a need to interact with the database, it is passed on to the repository, and repository is responsible to communicate with the database and fetch the results and send the response back to service, and service in turn sends the response back to controller, and finally user sees the response. So we don't have these two parts created yet, like the service and the repository. We are just working right now in the controller. Let us understand the controller first as to how it works, and then we will make way for each one of them. First service and then repository, wherein we'll work with the database. So for now, let's focus on controller. So here we have this controller created, wherein we have this variable array list, which is of type array list, and then we have a method that returns all the challenges. Now we need this to map to a endpoint over here, which is /challenges. So if the user says domain name /challenges, our application should return the list of challenges. So how do we create this mapping? So first you will have to mention over here an annotation, which is REST controller. So this annotation tells Spring Boot that this particular class is a controller, all right? And then we'll have to define another annotation. So if you say @, you can see two suggestions come up, Postmapping and GetMapping. So if you want to create a GetMapping, you can use GetMapping annotation. If you want to create a Postmapping, you can create Postmapping annotation. So I'll say GetMapping, and I'll mention over here challenges, like so. Okay. So what we are doing is we are telling Spring Boot that, hey, this is a controller, and whenever a request comes with this particular endpoint and it's a GET request, so execute this method. All right. That is what we are telling Spring Boot. Now let us run this project. So I'm going to go to challenge application, and here you're going to see this red, or sorry, not red, green button. So I'll click on that and I'll say run. Now this will start running the application. You'll see a progress at the top right here. Okay. And depending on your system, this will take some time. It should not take too long. Let me expand the logs. You should see logs coming up over here. Okay. And you should see this message in the end, started the application name, which indicates that our application has been started. All right. And you can see some information like Tomcat started. So Tomcat is a server which is inbuilt, and our application is running on Tomcat server on port 8080. All right. So let's head over to this port. So here in the browser, I'm going to open a new tab. I'm going to say localhost. I'm going to say 8080, and I'm going to say enter. So the moment you say this, you get an error, and this is the default error page that is available within Spring Boot. Okay, this is something that we have not created, but we are seeing this error message because we are trying to access a URL for which we have not defined any functionality. Okay, so if you take a look at our source code, okay, so if I minimize this, and if I go to our source code, we have defined the endpoint for /challenges and not for the root URL. So I need to go to /challenges. Now here you can see you have an empty array. Okay. So this empty array says that we don't have any data for the challenges. All right, which is fair enough. We have created an empty list, and that is what we are returning. Okay. You are seeing two buttons here, raw and past. Okay. So these buttons are coming in from a plugin that I have used, which is JSON formatter. Okay. So this is the plugin. If you search for JSON formatter, it's a Chrome plugin which is used to format JSON in your browser. Okay. So typically if there is a JSON response in your browser, it is going to look all jumbled up. Okay. So this plugin does the job of formatting it. Okay. And you can see it brings these two buttons, raw. So whether you want to view the data in the raw format or the past format. So I have this plugin installed. If you want to, you can use this. Otherwise, it's completely fine. Okay. But I just wanted to let you know that this is coming because of that plugin I'm using. Okay. So don't get confused as to what is this. So yeah, so this is an empty response. All right. So we are done adding an empty response. Now let us understand how did our application work and how was this request served. So this request is getting served by our application. Okay. And if you add any object or anything in the array list, you are going to see the data over here. Okay. So let me show that as well to you. So I'm here in the controller class, and let me add a single challenge, okay, to our list so that we can see some output over here. So I'm going to create a constructor. I'm going to say public challenge controller. And here I'm going to say challenge. So a challenge object challenge1 is equal to new challenge. And here I'm going to define the challenge. Okay. So I'm going to say 1L, which is the ID, January. Okay. And then I'm going to have the challenge description. So I'm going to say learn a new programming language. And I'm going to add this particular challenge 1 to challenges. Now, if I rerun the application, let us rerun since we have made a change. So for every change, you have to redeploy your application, and the application needs to rerun on the server. So I'll switch over to my browser and I'll hit refresh. So here now you can see the data that we have initialized our challenge list with is coming in as a JSON. So this API is now working for us. And now let us talk about how our API worked. Okay. So let us analyze the logs for this. Okay. So let me expand this a bit and let me go to the top. So at the top, if you see, you have the Spring banner. Okay. This prints in Spring and it prints Spring Boot and the version of Spring Boot that you are using. Okay. Then you see this message which says that the application is being started. Okay. Now, if you scroll down a bit here, you will see where all the environmental variables are being set. Okay. So here it's making use of profiles. Okay. And with the help of profiles, all the application variables are being set. And there are currently no active profiles because it's a brand new project that we have created and we have not defined any profiles. But profiles is a concept using which you can set environmental variables or some properties when you're running your application. For example, you can have different profiles or properties for dev environment, prod environment, QA environment, and so on. All right. So there's no active profile. So it picks up the default, which is fine for us at this stage. Then Spring Boot has an embedded server. Okay. So it comes with an embedded Tomcat server, and the next set of logs talk about how Tomcat initialization happens. And Tomcat is initialized for port 8080. Okay. And it starts the service. So the service is started and then the servlet engine is started. Okay. Now, after the servlet engine is started, the mapping of the URL and everything happens. Okay. And if you scroll down here, the application is fully started, as you can see. Now, finally, in the end, okay, we have the dispatcher servlet being initialized. Okay. And this dispatcher servlet is responsible for dispatching the requests to the appropriate controller. And then the initialization is completely done. So our application is ready, okay, as you can see, onto a particular port, which is port 8080. All right, so this is how our application runs. Now, what happens is when you hit this query, okay, when you hit this URL in the browser, so here is where our application is run. So we say localhost because we are running it on a local machine. And we say colon 8080 because this is the port on which our application is running right now. So if you have deployed your Spring Boot application, this will typically be replaced by your domain name. Okay, so you can have like abc.com/challenges. All right, or you can have api.abc.com/challenges if you are exposing your API. So this will be replaced by the domain name, and then you have /challenges. Now, when you access the URL that is mapped to your application, so excluding challenges, this is what is mapped to your application. Okay. Now, when you send a request here, what happens is the request is routed to the controller. So from like all the controllers that exist in the application. So let me tell you, in an application, there can be multiple controller files. That's perfectly normal. Okay. So if you're defining lots of entities and then you have lots of modules inside a single application, you can have different controllers for each one of them. That is completely normal. As of now, we have only one controller, and our application knows that whenever a request comes to this particular endpoint, it is supposed to go to this particular method and perform the action within this particular method. Now, what does this method do? It simply returns the list object. And on the fly, during runtime, this is what is converted into JSON and return to us as a response. So this is how typically our request flows right from the browser to the application, and then again it comes back to the browser. When we hit the URL, what we are doing is we are sending a request. Okay, we are sending a request to the server. After that request is being processed, we get a response object. So this is the part of the response object. Okay. Now response object has two parts. One is the response itself, and then you have the status code. So we'll talk about status code a bit. Okay. But we are only seeing the response right now because we are trying to access it from the browser. Okay. So this is how our application processes the request. Now let us head over to the next part wherein we will write some code which will allow users to add some challenges into our application. Okay. So let us switch over to our IDE. So here we have GetMapping. Okay. To accept the challenges into our application, we will need another type of request, which is nothing but Postmapping. So here you have this post annotation / challenges. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say over here, public void add challenge. Okay. And I'm going to write some code to add the challenges over here. Now, first thing, I need to map this to a URL. So how will I do that? You must have guessed it right. You will use Postmapping annotation. Okay. And you can say / challenges. So here the URL is same, but the request type is different. So GetMapping. So if a request comes with the type get, you will return all the challenges. If a request comes with the post request on the same endpoint, you will add the challenge. So same endpoint, but it's providing two behaviors based on the request type. Okay. Now what are we going to do over here? So we are going to add the challenges, and we are going to say over here challenges dot add, and I'll add challenge over here. Okay. So we need to add this challenge object, and I can return challenge added successfully. I can return this string over here. Okay. But it will return, like it will give you an error because we have mentioned void over here. So I can hover on this and make this return a string. Okay. So this will return string. Now where do we get this challenge object from? So this is the challenge that user wants to add into our application. So how do we get this object from the user? So we need to add this as a parameter over here. Okay. So I'll say challenge. Okay. Now the question is, how does this method gets this parameter? Okay. So this method gets this parameter in the from the request body. Now what do I mean by request body? So whenever you send a post request typically has some additional information with it, and that is known as the request body. And request body will have some additional request parameters that are typically needed to complete that request. Okay. And I'm going to accept the challenge object as the request body here with Postmapping. So I'll have to tell Spring Boot that, hey, you need to get this object from the request body. How do I tell this? With a simple annotation. So I can say @request body. Now this will tell Spring Boot that, hey, whenever you get a post request on /challenges, you can call this method, but you have to also get the request body and put this or wrap that request body into this object, and that object is passed on to this particular method here, which then adds it to the challenge list. Okay. And that is how the challenge is added. All right. So let us rerun our application now. So I'll stop and I'll rerun. So our application is up and running. Now the question is, how do I send a post request from the browser? Okay. So you cannot send a post request from a browser. You need a tool, like a tool from where you can query any API or where you can create a request. And using that particular tool, you should be able to send all the kinds of requests like get request, post request, put request, and even a delete request. Okay. So what tool shall we use? So there are multiple tools in the market, but the one that I'm going to prefer is Postman. Okay. So Postman is nothing but it's an API platform for building and using APIs. Okay. And if you are already a developer, you must be well aware of Postman. All right. So this is the official website of Postman, which is postman.com. And you can see like there are tons of developers who are using Postman already. And this is the most popular tool out there to work with API requests. Okay. There are many other tools also, but this one is most popular. And you can go through all the features here. Okay. If you wish to, or what you can do is you can download Postman. Okay. So here you can see download the desktop app for Windows, Mac, and Linux. So whichever platform you are on, you can click the icon for that and you can download the .exe or executable file for your own OS. Okay. So download this and then the installation process is fairly straightforward. So you have to just follow the installation steps like any other application on your operating system and boom, you're done. So I have already installed this particular application. So this is Postman already installed on my system. Okay. So if you open the interface, you might be asked some onboarding questions, and if you skip all of them, you will see this particular screen. Okay. Where you can see multiple options at the top. Okay. So there is an option home. You have option to access workspaces for which you need to create an account. You have an option to explore. If you click on explore, you should be able to browse all the open APIs. Okay. So I'll go back to the offline API client. So this particular interface here is called as offline API client interface by Postman. This interface has two parts. Okay. So one is the left part on which you will see all the requests that you have executed. So this is a place wherein you will see history of all the requests that you have executed. And on the right hand side, you will have a way to create and execute your request. And here at the bottom, you can see response. So here you will see response from all the requests that you have sent. Okay. You can even save your request and do a lot of stuff with Postman. Okay. You can save your request so that you don't have to create that request again. So if you're using a request, a lot of times you can make use of that feature. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a post request. So you can see over here, we have this drop down to get the post request. We'll copy the URL. I'll paste the URL here. Okay. Now with the post request, we need to specify the body. So here you can see the body tag. I'll click on this and you have multiple options here. None, form data. So I'll say raw and I'll select the format as JSON. Okay. So here we'll add some JSON data wherein we'll pass in the information to create a new challenge. Okay. If you want, you can copy this JSON here. So I'll copy this and I'll paste it here. Okay. So we'll use the same JSON, in fact. So I'll create the challenge. Okay. So I'll say February and I'll say learn a new or create a new app, something like this. So what I'm doing is I'm creating a post request to this endpoint, and within request body, I'm sending some JSON data, which is the structure of my challenge object. So all the parameters that typically a challenge needs is what I'm sending along with this request. Now let me trigger this. The moment you trigger this, you will see a message, challenge added successfully, 200 OK. So you can see you're getting a response message and a status code over here. Now, what does a status code means? So status codes talks about the status of the request. So when you send a request, what happened to that request? Was it successfully executed? Did it fail? Was it redirected to some other server? Or if it failed, whose issue it was? Was it you who was sending the bad request, or was it an issue on the server's end? So all of this is communicated with the help of status codes, and there are different status codes that are available, and these status codes are standard defined for HTTP protocol. So if you're getting 200, it means okay. 200 okay means your request was successful. So if you get 201 created, it means you had asked the server to create something for you and it's created. Okay. So typically in a post request wherein you are adding a new challenge, you should get 201 created if you want to. Like as per the rule, it should be 201 created. But right now we have not defined that and we'll go to that. But yes, we are getting 200, which means that our request is successful. Okay. Now you can even have like 400, which is nothing but bad request. Then you have internal server error. Okay. It has a status code as well. So this way, different status codes have different meanings and it helps you understand if you're communicating over the HTTP protocol as to what happened to your request. Okay. So here we got okay, which means everything is okay. And here you can see this is a request that we just executed. It will come in the form of history. Okay. And what I can do is I can now convert this into get request and I can send this. Now, if you send this as get request, you will see you are now getting two challenges. So this is the initial challenge that we have initialized in the app. Then you have the February challenge as well, where we say create a new app. And this is something that we just created using Postman. Okay. So the code to add a challenge into our application is working perfectly fine. All right. Which means we have successfully executed our post request over here.